Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome wherever you are to this webinar brought to you by the Critical Path Institute on event-driven eDiaries. This is a webinar referencing a paper that was published at the end of 2025, which was a collaboration between CPATH's eCOA consortium, which I lead, and the PCE consortium. Before we begin with the major detail, a chance for you to listen to the highlights of the paper and ask your questions. Standard disclaimer applies that the views and opinions expressed are those of the speakers and should not be attributed to their organisations or to CPATH. The slides and intellectual property of the individual presenters. We have FDA contribution today, which we're delighted about, and our standard FDA acknowledgement applies here as well in terms of the contribution that FDA makes to the operations of the Critical Path Institute. Audience participation is very much encouraged. We don't do verbal interaction in terms of asking our attendees to pose questions verbally. Within the Zoom platform, you will see the Q&A function at the top in the toolbar. Please post any questions you have. If you have any comments you'd like to make, which often happens in these events, feel free to submit them there as well. The chat function is only if you are experiencing any technical issues. If you submit a question via the chat function, it will be disregarded. I'll try and remind people of that as we move forward, but comments and questions in particular, we're very keen to get through the Q&A function. Thank you very much for your attention to that. Looking forward to all the questions that come. So, as we said, a collaboration, this particular piece of work, as many of the outputs from an eCOA kind of perspective or focus are, the collaborations between the technology providers, language service providers, CROs, DHT companies that form part of the membership of the eCOA consortium, and the sponsor organisations part of the PCE consortium. And the eCOA consortium is this year celebrating its 15th anniversary. Many, if you're not already familiar with the constitution of our consortium, then I'm sure you'll recognise an awful lot names there, and we'll be shortly adding another one to take us up to 24. And also the previously known as the PRO Consortium, but for some time now has been rebranded as the Patient-Centered Evidence Consortium. 25 active pharmaceutical companies with FDA representation, as all the consortia at CPATH has, and a range of other entities that input into their work. So transforming patient-centered outcomes into evidence that drives decisions, which I think we can all get behind as a very noble ambition. Okay. The objectives of this webinar, this session today, to explore the genesis of the project that I referred to that delivered the article that was published later on. We've got a QR code later on for anyone who hasn't had a chance to read it yet, but you'll get a lot of the good detail here today. Understanding the need for alignment on terminology, which is one of the key attributes. So this is something we really want to reflect on. Explore obviously the key recommendations that are made within the paper, and then take a look to the future of what we think might need to come next to try and build out this concept and everything related to it. It's a challenging piece of implementation around capturing the trial participant's voice, so that's why the paper came about. So we've got a great panel. We've got a extensive panel, but we wanted to make sure that we gave opportunity to all those who gave very substantial contributions towards the paper and are part of this today. So they're coming on camera now just to prove that they're actually real. They're not figments of my imagination. Jessica Abel, who Director of Patient Experience Data Policy and Best Practices at AbbVie. Paul O'Donoghue, Senior Director of eCOA Product and Science and Metadata. Emuela Flood, Director of Patient-Reported Outcomes at AstraZeneca. Manuela Bossi, the Assistant Director of Scientific Consulting at Savoda. Megan Fitter, Clinical Outcome Assessment Scientist at FDA. And the lead author, Flo Molam, Chief Scientific Officer from Umotive. Flo will join us for the Q&A discussion, but the other 5 colleagues will be presenting alongside me. So thank you for coming on camera, everyone. Great to see you today. Okay, the genesis. How did this come about? This was kind of freaky in a way, if I may say so. I've received a contact from David Reesner from the Division of Clinical Outcome Assessments, who's the primary liaison to the PCE consortium. And he asked me, do we have any best practices around event-driven eDiaries? And we didn't. We'd had plenty of discussion on that, but we hadn't had actually any sort of like consensus developed recommendations. So that absence was interesting. So, but coincidentally, I had contact from Emuela, one of our presenters on the panel today, who asked a very similar question in a very similar time frame. Then we also had contact from another of our eCOA consortium representatives who asked me an almost identical question. So clearly the need was there. We needed to get some consensus about how to define this particular type of the capture of data from a trial participant. The other driver was, as I said a few minutes ago, inconsistent terminology, how we are referring to it. This is a blight to kind of what we do in capturing a patient voice and in general clinical trial execution, trying to make sure we're aligned on terminology, but it was particularly pertinent to this particular topic area. And how to implement this best in clinical trials. Those are the highlights we're trying to pull out today. So this is kind of like what we're trying to focus on today, is really what we've come as a consensus together with multiple FDA contributions as well. Megan's here today, but we did have several other FDA colleagues involved to try and develop this resource that helps us move forward. So as we say, on the screen on the left, you see all the organizations that the co-authors were representing in the development of the paper at the time of publication. Some things have changed here and there for that. Same for the sponsors on the right-hand side. Everyone was there. And we do want to recognise particularly Jay Trudeau, who moved away from Lilly not too long ago to an interesting role in a different arena, and also Jill Platko, who was a very key driver to this, who exited from Savoda last year, I believe. And also FDA in the centre. So if you haven't read the paper, shame on you. But apart from that, it's the QR code is there, and we'd recommend it. But hopefully, as we said, you get a lot of the good detail today. So enough of the introduction. Now I'm going to pass over to Jess, who'll start taking us down the journey of what is an eDED.
Thanks so much, Scotty, and it's a pleasure to be here. And as Scotty noted, alignment on terminology was really a key issue in how we were coming together around developing best practices for event-driven electronic diaries. So what is an eDED? It's an electronic data collection tool that's designed to capture a predefined event as it happens or as close to real time as possible. So it records both the occurrence of the event and any details associated with that specific event. Now we'll make some distinctions as we go along between eDEDs and other approaches, but in terms of scheduled assessments, these collect information at fixed intervals, very distinct from how we think about capturing them on an event-driven basis with an eDED. And so in the example you see here, you can see how eDEDs allow users to start and end events in contrast to that scheduled diary that simply asks whether a symptom occurred within a specific recall period. And in the next slide, I'll get to some further details on some of these key distinguishing characteristics between these approaches. Next slide, please. There we go. And here you see this comparison between eDEDs, those scheduled diaries, and what we call ecological momentary assessment, or EMA. And the key difference really lies in what triggers the data entry. So eDEDs are event triggered, so data are captured when a predefined event occurs, again, as close to that event as possible. And this is particularly useful when detailed information is needed about each individual event being reported, such as we think about bowel movement reporting or reporting of bleeding episodes. Scheduled diaries are time triggered, so patients enter information at set time intervals, such as daily or weekly, which is often common, and it's whether or not the event occurred. So there's often better opportunity for collecting information via this route that can be summarized over a specified time period, such as daily reporting of pain severity, but it relies more heavily on patients' ability to recall over that specified time period. EMA uses repeated sampling over time to capture momentary states or behaviors to understand these experiences over time, regardless of event occurrence. And while this is also a way to reduce recall bias, it's not tied to a specific event in the way eDEDs are. So overall, eDEDs are conceptually distinct from these other approaches because they really focus on the event-based capture rather than that routine collection through those scheduled assessments or random sampling through EMA. Now I'm going to turn it over to Emuela to really highlight when eDEDs might be considered the best choice for a particular study.
Thanks, Jess. So another key question that we wanted to address in the paper is when an event-driven eDiary is the right choice. And I can tell you that when I first joined a study that involved an event-driven diary, this was question number one for me. Do we really need an event-driven diary, or would an evening diary be the appropriate choice? And so really there are two main considerations when deciding whether to use an event-driven diary versus a traditional, say, evening diary. One is around the frequency of the events, and the other is around the characteristics of that event and the specific endpoint that you are using. And so first, if we talk about the frequency of events, a scenario where the number of events is high, this is a scenario where an event-driven diary may be particularly useful. If the event is going to occur many times per day, and the information that you need to collect about the event is detailed and would be difficult to remember, say at the end of the day, then this is a scenario for an event-driven diary. If we take the example of, say, IBS, where patients with IBS are likely to have many bowel movements per day, and where we typically want to capture not just the frequency of those events, but also information about the event, like stool consistency or whether urgency was experienced with the event, then that is a good case example for the use of an event-driven diary. On the other hand, if the condition is associated with a low frequency of events and where the information about the event that you need to collect is very memorable, then perhaps an event-driven diary isn't the best choice. So an example might be headaches. If what you're interested in is capturing the number of headaches and these are memorable events, then an evening diary may be appropriate. The other consideration is around the nature of the event. So for example, in a case where you want to capture the duration that an event lasted or when an event resolved, then an event-driven diary may be particularly useful for this scenario. So in the case of hemophilia, for example, a hemophilia bleed can last hours, it can last days. And so if the interest is in capturing the duration of that event, then an event-driven diary would be really helpful for capturing that information with greater precision. And so the real takeaway message here is that there isn't really a one-size-fits-all about this choice. It really depends on the nature of the event and your specific endpoint. And so now I will turn it over to Manuela to talk about key design considerations.
Thank you so much, Emanuela. So we've just heard from Emanuela when an event-driven diary is the right choice. So now what we'd like to question is, once you've decided to use an event-driven diary, how can you design it well? What are the key considerations to be made for defining exactly what to capture, all the way from what to the possible entry window? So in the following 6 slides, we'll present general best practice recommendation, which you'll see to the left of the slide, against a practical application in the context of developmental and epileptic encephalopathy, or DEE. Well, while in the paper, you might see other examples of application, including those that Emanuela just named, such as hemophilia or hypoglycemia. We chose DEE because it sits at the complex end, and this is due to the heterogeneous nature of the condition and the fact that it affects primarily children and adolescents, but presents or persists in adulthood as well. So when we think about what data to capture, this is the very first question to answer when deciding how to capture the data. The guiding principle here is that what we collect should be in alignment with the protocol endpoints. So every item should be informative, as well as linked to an endpoint, avoiding wherever possible unnecessary potential burden of completion and the related implementation complexity when adding unnecessary data. So for example, collecting date and time, although might not be linked to a specific endpoint becomes mandatory and important when we extend the diary completion beyond, for example, the typical 2 day or 24 hours, because it gives the reporter the ability to anchor the report to when it actually happened. And this is keeping in mind that the date time stamp recorded in an electronic system does not necessarily correspond to the date and time when the event actually occurred. When we look at the duration, and in the context of seizures in DEE, it becomes particularly relevant. There might be studies where capturing the length, i.e. the opening and closing time of an event is mandatory to inform endpoints, and other studies where this is redundant. So specific consideration must be made whether to have this feature captured or not. And along with what I've just said, we need to plan for all additional disease or study specific functionalities to be implemented. For instance, if we look into DEE, it's important to record the type of seizures in words that are familiar to the observer. And this might not necessarily correspond with the clinical classifications, which needs to be matched in the background. So the relative functionalities should be considered. And when what the participant sees does not necessarily correspond to the background classifications, we need to have all the necessary data set and data structure resources in place to be able to match all the relevant data to each participant ID without disaggregating data into different data sets. Some additional considerations can be made around rescue medications. There are instances where it's mandatory to record whether a rescue medication has been used linked to a specific event occurrence, in which case the rescue medication should be an item in the diary. But often there is not a practical need of having this attribute in the diary, and rather this information can be captured in eCRF and should be captured just there to avoid possible duplicates or redundant data from the diary data sets. It's also important to consider how to structure the diary in the case of a high-frequency event, such as could be the seizure manifestations over, for example, 24 hours. When that's the case, it's important to make the relevant considerations and either allow to report whether multiple events occurred by asking the relative questions. And at the same time, if nothing has been reported, it becomes super important to have the ability to confirm that no events occurred. This could be a question asked day by day or in group of days where nothing has been reported. If we go to the next slide, and in relation to what data has been captured, it becomes very important to look at who will be capturing the data, or who will be the reporter or the reporters. The paper stresses, I would say not enough, on the importance of prioritizing participants' self-report wherever possible. However, we know there are situations where, due, for example, to cognitive limitations or physical limitations or age, it is not possible for the participants to self-report. And in those cases, we have scenarios where either just one caregiver will be assigned as the reporter, one observer, sorry to be more precise, will be assigned as the reporter, or the participant and one reporter, or just two reporters and the two reporters. We do not consider having more than two reporters, because this would jeopardize the data set, impact the reliability and consistency of how the data have been reported, on top of other complexities that my colleagues will explain later on when doing even technical considerations. So when using multiple reporters, as we specify here in the slide, it's relevant to use the appropriate terminology. And so, for example, use generic wording without addressing you or your child, for example, in the question. And it becomes mandatory to assign each reporter to a specific and unique role and identifier so that we can always capture in the metadata who has entered the specific data. And if a review screen becomes available, it's also relevant and at times mandatory to highlight who has reported an event. Now, in the context of DEE, it's all these considerations must be taken into consideration. And so we have to be careful how many observers we allow. We need to train each caregivers, and this is always applicable, so that they know exactly what to answer. And linking to what I previously explained, it becomes important to define when there is an observer reporting what happened to the participants, that every item they report, every item they answer is something they can witness. With these, I mean that details such as the frequency or the manifestation of certain symptoms is something that an observer can report, whereas in contrast, the severity, for example, of the perceived symptom is something that only the participants themselves can be able to rate. And with these, I'll pass it on to Paul to do additional considerations around key aspects to keep in mind when designing the optimal EDED.
Lovely. Thank you, Muela. So I'm going to continue by defining how we actually capture the event. So obviously we heard defining the reporter of the event is very important. And once you've done that, it's going to be a self-report or observer, caregiver report. Another interesting consideration, though, for actually triggering and capturing the event is the possibility of using a sensor. And DEE actually provides a good example of this, where a sensor may be able to detect when a seizure is actually happening. And it then has the ability, depending on the technology being used, to trigger the initiation of the event reported diary, asking the participant to report, well, first of all, confirm that they are having a seizure, and then continuing to actually report on that seizure in near real time. But then we get into two nuances that can be particularly challenging from a technology perspective around the kinds of events that we might be tracking. And basically, we can have events that can only happen one at a time, or we can have events that you might get multiple events at the same time. So if it's a single ongoing event, think of a migraine. You can only really have one migraine at any given moment. You really need to make sure that that event is closed before the patient goes on to report a second event, because they can only have a single event at any one time. They need to be closing out an ongoing event before they go on to report a new event. Where things can get tricky is where you might have multiple events happening in parallel. Think of maybe bleeds, for example. You could, in theory, have multiple bleeds all happening at the same time, all with their distinct description and distinct answers to the various diary questions you're collecting. And so you need to make it really clear to users which events are open, which events are closed, and prompting them to close events, but also allowing them to keep them ongoing if the event is, in fact, continuing to keep going. So there's a number of these considerations around how you actually trigger the event. Typically, it's going to be the patients themselves, but there is some interesting technology solutions potentially that can drive the triggering of those events. And then being really clear, is this just an event that happens one at a time, or may there be multiple events happening in parallel? And if so, ensuring the system can support that complexity and allowing the patient to report on multiple events, but also prompting them to close out events where appropriate. The next slide deals with some additional nuances that we don't typically deal with more, I'll put in inverted commas, traditional questionnaires or scheduled diaries. And this is a best practice around displaying a summary of previous events that have been reported by patients in the event-driven diary, or otherwise referred to as kind of a catch-up diary, summarizing what a patient has already reported. Typically, we do not want to display back to a patient anything they've submitted in a traditional PRO. We want to avoid biasing patients on how they're answering in the moment based on reminding them on how they might have answered previously. But specifically in the context of event-driven diaries, where maybe patients are reporting multiple events over the course of a day, it can be tricky keeping all those events straight in their head. And obviously, one of the key benefits of event-driven diaries is a patient is reporting in near real time. And therefore, that does minimize the risk of confusion, of forgetting what happened this morning versus this afternoon. But it also really helps to display back within a defined data entry window a list of key information from the events that have already been submitted. So again, you really want to limit it to that particular time window of entry. You really want to only display information required to actually identify any given unique event. You don't necessarily want to display, for example, how severe a patient rated a migraine. You might just want to say you did report a migraine this morning. You want to show those in the order of occurrence to again give them that sense of how the day unfolded or how the reporting of their events unfolded. And you again don't want to show anything that might bias how they could report what's going on in the moment. So those really kind of strongly subjective things around rating of pain or severity, you typically won't want to be showing that to a patient. If there's the opportunity of multiple reporters, actually having reported events over the course of that data entry window, you would want to tag which reporter submitted which event, again, just in helping identify when those events were recorded. And again, highlighting which events might still be open, which might still be ongoing, as an additional prompt to remind patients to actually close out those events if the appropriate time has come. So I'm going to hand over to Emuela, who will talk a bit about how we deal with reminders in the context of event-driven diaries.
Great, thanks, Paul. So another key best practice is to schedule reminders. There are two main reasons for this. One is the fact that patients sometimes are not able to report on the event in real time, even though that's the intent. And the other is that if there are no events entered, it may be either because there were no events or because the patient forgot to enter an event. So the use of reminders is really important to address both of those issues. So for example, if we know life happens and patients may not be able to report an event as soon as it occurs. Also, we know that some events may be debilitating. They may cause severe pain, they may cause fatigue, and it would be really difficult for the patient to report at that time. And so the scheduled reminder gives an opportunity for the patient to enter any events that were not entered in real time. And again, in terms of the fact that we need to know if no event means that there actually was no event or whether the patient forgot to complete an event. And so it's really important to make sure that that is captured. Because I can tell you just from my own experience, we did have scheduled reminders and we had a catch-up diary, but there was no explicit question that asked whether or not the patient had an event to add in that catch-up diary. And it meant that we were not certain whether the no events was because they didn't have any or because they forgot to enter them. And so that was definitely a lesson learned. We can go to the next slide. Another best practice is to determine the data entry window. So again, we may find that patients aren't able to enter the event in real time. And so we need to allow some flexibility so that they can enter at a later time. But at the same time, we want to make sure that the information is accurate. So we want to define a maximum time interval that would be appropriate between the occurrence of the event and when the event is reported. Another best practice is that we don't want to allow changes to previous entries to be made by reporters. It doesn't mean that if a respondent wants to make a correction that they can't. They certainly can, but we would want to do that through a data request change process so that that information is clearly tracked. In terms of practical application in the example of epilepsy, here it's common to allow events to be collected within 7 days of an event. And so in this type of scenario, one thing that would be important would be to make sure that there's a place for the reporter to enter the date that the event occurred so that it's not confused. Also, it's important from a burden perspective that if the occurrences are entered on days after the event, that you allow for multiple entries to be included. It's just helpful from a burden perspective. Also, it's important that the system does not allow the reporter to enter a date that falls outside of that time window. So if they're allowed to report an event that happened within 7 days, you wouldn't want them to enter a date that occurs, say, 2 weeks prior. And so I guess just one last point would be that while we do need to allow some flexibility there, we do want to make sure that we encourage patients to enter in real time to the extent that they can, so that we can make sure that the information is accurate, as accurate as possible. And so just lastly, I wanted to point out that we do have different practical examples for different conditions. So for example, hemophilia, as well as hypoglycemia and some other examples that highlight the differences in these types of events and how these different approaches might be addressed. So for example, as has already been mentioned by Paul, in hemophilia, it's a scenario where you might have multiple events happening at the same time. So you need to think about how that should be handled. And then with hypoglycemia, it's a good case example of where you might use a sensor to trigger the event. And so that has additional implications in terms of design. And so now I would like to turn it over to Megan.
Thanks so much, Mwela. Just like any other type of clinical outcome assessment, reviewers at the FDA rely on a set of validity evidence to determine whether an event-driven eDiary is going to be fit for purpose to contribute to efficacy endpoints that are aimed at regulatory decision-making. So here I'll present some of the key examples of this type of validity evidence from the patient-focused drug development guidance series that can be really helpful for reviewers in order to support an event-driven eDiary. One of these key types of validity evidence is a conceptual framework. And this is essentially a representation of how the data from the diary actually map on to the specific concept of interest that you want to measure. And another kind of overarching category of evidence that's really important is evidence of content validity, specifically in your proposed context of use, such as a patient population. And some aspects of this that are useful is determining whether the event-driven eDiary is capturing important parts of that concept of interest that you're intending to measure. And it also is important to see whether the diary is measuring a concept of interest that in itself is important to patients and meaningful to patients. There's a lot of different ways to generate content validity evidence. Some of them are interviews from patients, and then you can also use literature, provided it's relevant and from the target population. And then the last one I'll mention here is from the quantitative perspective, looking at evidence of psychometric properties and ensuring that a diary is psychometrically sound. And some of these properties that are really useful to look at are internal consistency and test-retest reliability. So these are just some of the key examples. There's a lot more details on this type of validity evidence in the patient-focused drug development guidance series, particularly the third guidance in our series, which is selecting, developing, or modifying fit-for-purpose clinical outcome assessments. And I will, with that, pass it back to Jess.
Thank you so much, Megan. So what are some of the non-therapeutic area specific best practices that we really need to think about when implementing eDiaries in a study? So first and foremost, plan your device strategy. This includes consideration of whether an app on a phone that reporters can install on their own devices may actually be beneficial. This really coincides with how we approach BYOD, as well as whether there's a need for offline capability, which we do recommend to account for potential connectivity issues when events are intended to be recorded whenever they occur, as is the case with eDiaries. And we also encourage adherence to our established electronic implementation best practices that are outlined in the article here by Mullen et al., and ensuring usability of the device to really confirm the appropriateness of this data collection mode in your target population and to ultimately support patient completion throughout your trial. Compliance monitoring is also an important consideration, particularly given all of the challenges that are associated with the eDiaries and not knowing the number of expected reports. And this can be built in through the use of scheduled reminders for reporters, as Emuela noted and went through in terms of the details, but reminders should be designed to not only remind patients to record any events that were not entered in real time, but also obtain confirmation of the absence of events in a given reporting window. And if you have this information, you can design thresholds for the number of consecutive days of actual missing entries where no responses were recorded. And in predefining this could then trigger an alert for sites to follow up and support compliance in your study. Next slide, please. So looking ahead as we approach more frequent use of eDiaries in trials across therapeutic areas, it will be really beneficial for us to have more publicly available examples of how these data collection tools have been implemented to really assess adoption, inclusive of details on study design choices that can help inform our future best practices in this space. And while the use of sensors to identify or capture events does actually present an emerging area of opportunity, there is a need for further research to really support their use for event-driven data collection. And finally, as Megan noted, guidance exists on the types of validity evidence that are needed to support an eDiary as fit for purpose, but additional research that demonstrates evidence of validity specific to these types of data collection tools would be beneficial in moving the field forward. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Scotty to lead us through the Q&A.
Great, lovely stuff, Jess. Thank you to you and all the panelists for sharing those details. We've got a lot of questions, so let's get straight to it. First of all, we did give the opportunity for everyone who registered for the event. It was great to see so many of you here. To remind you, please use the Q&A function, but everyone started doing that now, to submit a question in advance. So actually, we've received a few. Some of them are a little out of scope, but there was two questions for two separate individuals that were largely the same. And I'm going to come to you, Flo, if I could, to address this one. How do you treat compliance with event-driven eDiaries? Non-response can be due to no event, or to report, or is it non-compliant? So we've got basically that same sort of question. How do you distinguish between no event and missing data?
Yeah, thanks, Scotty. So that's definitely something that is covered in the paper in a few different sections, I think. So one thing with event-driven diaries is the importance of capturing the absence of an event just as much as the events that are occurring, and to be able to distinguish that from someone forgetting to complete the diary or not completing the diary. A lot of the time, endpoints in a trial will be aiming towards reducing the number of events or potentially event-free days. So having confirmation that an event has not occurred is in some ways just as important as capturing the occurrence of an event. And that is why within the diary, we have specifically said that there's the importance of having that reminder system for people to at least be capturing the absence of an event. That also allows you to have a compliance calculation, because we know with event-driven diaries, we can't predict when an event will occur and we don't know how many to expect to occur. But if we know that we should have at least one diary entry per day, which is either reporting an event or the absence of events, then we have some data point in which to calculate compliance. And this also enables sites to follow up where people are not being compliant with the diary and resolve any issues. So that's how we recommend capturing and monitoring compliance for event-driven diaries.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Flo. The next of many questions, I'm going to come to Paul for this one, if I may. What if some seizure types cannot be matched to a clinical seizure type, but are still important to capture? Can these still be captured in the event-driven eDiary?
Yeah, good question. I think I'd say in theory we can capture almost anything in these diaries. They're highly flexible, and during the design phase, as we're setting up these systems, we can give the flexibility to capture nearly anything. It really comes down to a study design question. I think fundamentally that's what you're touching on in regards to what is the thing of interest that we're even measuring. And I think, seizures can be tricky. Maybe you could extend that to things like migraines and other events where's the line between a headache, a very bad headache, and a migraine. I think very clearly making sure you as a study team are clear on what it is you're measuring, finding a way to articulate that to the patient, to clearly educate the patient, and then finding ways of defining that within the diary so it can be easily selected by the patients so that you aren't capturing these things that don't count as, in your example, seizures, or at least not clinically defined as seizures. So I would suggest it's more of a study design question than a technology question. And it's just being very clear on what you're measuring and finding a way to clearly articulate that to patients and summarize that in a diary so it's easy for the patients to report it.
That's good, Paul. Thank you. Any other comments on that from the group? Okay. We've got plenty of other questions to get through. The next one, which will come to Megan, yourself, if you wouldn't mind. What would be the best practice in terms of the maximum recall period for an event-driven eDiary? Since whilst an event is ongoing, responding to the eDiary isn't going to be the #1 priority. And then they may forget until taking another diary action. Any thoughts on that, Megan? Sorry, Megan, you're on mute. Sorry. Sorry, Megan, you're on mute, I'm afraid. Something's muted there. We've lost you.
Can you hear me now?
There you are. Please go ahead.
Okay,
Thanks.
perfect. Great. So yeah, being thoughtful about the recall period is going to be super important for data quality. So I'm glad that you brought this question up. So on a high level, the answer is it depends, as it so often is. And it's going to depend on a few different things, such as how memorable is the event, how often is the event, and a good way to answer this question of what should the recall period be, the maximum recall period in certain contexts of use, is patient-focused research. So, for example, just straight up asking patients in that population about how their ability is to recall in different periods of time. And this can be an open-ended question, or it could be very specifically cognitively debriefing different recall periods in the piloting of your eDiary. So overall, patient-focused research and asking patients is going to be really important for determining that maximum recall period.
That's good. Thanks so much, Megan. Right, I'm scanning down the list here. My goodness, we're trying to make sure we're not duplicating questions here if at all possible. Okay, we've got one here. Jess, can I come to you for this one? This is going to be, what would be an example of some additional contextual information collected around an event that is reported? Can you give an example or some examples of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about additional details around an event reported, a lot of times it's time of the event occurrence, duration, perhaps severity, and depending on what the event is, location of the event. So thinking about the example that we mentioned earlier around bowel movements, we actually have developed and qualified a diary for irritable bowel syndrome that uses an event-driven nature to capture characteristics associated with each bowel movement reported in an event-driven way. And some of these include straining, stool consistency, or incomplete evacuation. So those are all characteristics that help to provide additional information on the bowel movements that occur in the context of that study to inform the endpoints for the trial. And when we think about maybe even bleeding episodes, it could include information on the start and end time and site of the bleed. So those are just some examples, but definitely variability and depending on the event that's being reported.
Great stuff, Jess. Thanks so much for that. Okay, let's come to Emuela. We're going to come to you for this one. Who determines whether an interested or relevant symptom event is memorable or not? What a great question that is. Emuela?
That is a great question. I think we often think about memorable events as ones that are particularly severe, particularly impactful. Maybe they're ones that don't happen, many times a day, and therefore they are more memorable. But I think, to Megan's point, I think really this is a question that should be answered through patient research. We should talk to patients and hear from them about whether an event, they consider it to be memorable, whether it's something that they can report on, several days after the fact. So I think that patient research is really critical to answering that question, and it may be, context specific.
That was reasonable. Thank you so much. Okay. Let's have a look. So we've had quite a few questions that are kind of along a similar theme. Flo, Manuel, I've got to come to you in a moment. I'll come to you next. But Flo, we had a few questions on how to handle reporting of seizures when a child is at school during the day. Multiple potential reporters. How can you identify duplicate event reporting with certainty? That's another great question. And another one about what about in terms of severe events as well. The third party component of that. Are you able to sort of gather together a response that addresses those three?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's important to iterate that participant safety always comes first. There's no expectation for them to be entering data in the midst of a serious event. Obviously, with event-driven diaries, the idea is to be able to capture data as close to the event as possible, but there's no expectation that people would be reporting, or even a caregiver reporting whilst they're trying to support their child, for example, in the midst of an event. So I just want to be very clear about that, and that is also why we have that recall period, time window around which you can report events. I think in terms of when a child is at school, for example, this again comes down to the contemporaneousness of the data, and obviously we have to accept that real life is happening and figure out ways around this. I think the likely scenario is either you would give the teachers or a caregiver at school access and their login to the diary as well to report, or it's likely that maybe they're just tracking it on paper and they would give that information to the parent at the end of the day, not in a paper backup, but just in probably as they give updates on how the child was throughout the day at school, that the parent could then enter into the diary itself. I think sometimes, we know not everything is ideal, but we have to also accept that real life is happening. And then again, around multiple potential reporters, I think we touch on this in the paper as well, around the fact that we should always be able to track exactly who has been reporting, so having a unique identifier for each reporter. And we also touch on the fact that in certain scenarios, you might want a review screen where people can see what data has been entered. And if you had multiple reporters, it would be likely that you'd want to have the information about the event as well as who reported it to try and remove the likelihood of duplicate event reporting. But it's also, I think, important to remember that if parents are both reporting, the likelihood is that they are communicating with each other when they have a child who is experiencing these events. So that is also likely to remove the likelihood of that duplicate data. And then the last one from, I think, around the analysis of this is, I think Megan's kind of touched on it, and we touch on it on the paper around what is considered sort of more subjective data versus objective data, and perhaps why diaries that are more sort of objective counts of things rather than a subjective rating have traditionally been in event-driven diaries and not maybe gone through the same validation process as other COAs. But I think you have the information about who has been reporting, which will allow you to do any sensitivity analysis to understand if it has had an impact on your data. And I'm sure you can get some very helpful statistics advice from your statistician as well.
Great, thanks for taking all three at once in a comprehensive manner, Flo. Do appreciate that. So, Manuela, we've got a question here around sort of like looking at retroactive event capture. Are there any general guidelines on retrospective event-driven diary collection, or does it have to be based on the context of use and on the start of the trial itself?
I would think that this question could be rephrased depending on what study we are looking at. So generally speaking, probably looking at the study specifics, we can make the best call. During today's presentation, we gave a lot of key considerations to be made. So I think depending on what population, what's the indication, and what is the nature of the events to report, we can make a call as to how far back we should allow to open up the availability window. And so as all the speakers have presented in their own sections, there are many references in the paper that would guide when to open it up to more, for example, than 24 hours, and therefore whether to have retroactive event entries. I would stress on the fact that it is important to capture the patient absentees. And so on top of what could be the best design recommendations, some patients-driven usability and data can be very beneficial. And if someone else wants to jump in with some more details, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, if there's anything key, feel free, but we've still got a stack of questions to try and get through in the last 3 to 4 minutes. But thank you, Manuela, for addressing that. We've had a giant question here, which I'll try and summarize, and we'll come to Paul for this one, if I may. Some research published by Clario in April comparing EDEDs and prompted evening diaries. The findings suggest that allowing patients to use both provides greater flexibility for data capture. What are the others' perspectives on whether a design with this flexibility creates challenges when reviewing and interpreting the results or not? For example, a participant who experiences a migraine on Monday and records it in EDED at the time of occurrence, which is then on Wednesday, the same participant experiences another migraine but waits until the evening diary before recording it. I think I get the flow there. Paul, this sounds like a big question you'd love to rip apart. So can I throw this one over to you?
Definitely not rip apart. I think it gets at maybe a key point that we've been circling throughout the course of the presentation, and we're wrestling with within the paper itself, and also curious if any of my panelists have a different perspective, but it's almost feels like a definitional question to me, is what do you even mean by an evening diary in this context? Because I think when we're talking about these event-driven diaries, we do keep emphasizing capturing the data in real time, in inverted commas, all the caveats around what real time actually means. But the whole point being capturing as much as possible within real time. But we're recognizing the realities of life, as a number of my colleagues said, and giving this ability to, you know, first of all, summarize what a patient has submitted up until that point, and giving them the opportunity to submit anything they might have forgotten to submit over the course of the day. I think of that kind of summary, retrospective ability to top up their events. You can think of that as an evening diary. And it's really just, I think, a semantic thing we're circling around. I think the really interesting aspect of that question is, do we need to think of those events differently because they were reported at different time periods? I'm not a statistician. You know, in my opinion, I think as long as you're very clear, which we will be within these electronic systems, of exactly when this data was submitted, you're obviously, if it's a retrospective data capture, you're asking the patient to report the time they're reporting on. So you will have clear timestamps. and you will be able to identify what was in real time in inverted commas versus retrospective. I think I personally feel very comfortable, within a day, not feeling there's going to be significant differences in how patients are reporting. But then you start getting into questions of, well, if it's a very common event, if there's 4, 5, 6 events over the course of the day, are they really going to remember the details of event number 1 after they've reported 5 others? And so that's a very long-winded way of not answering the question, but just kind of emphasizing that I think, there's a semantic element to the distinction between event-driven diaries and evening diaries, and our best practices do highlight this kind of summary screen and capturing stuff retrospectively at the end of the day. And then the analysis piece, I think you just have to take on a case-by-case basis. Typically, you will be able to compare, at least within the course of a day, but for very common events or for events stretching over a long period of time, you probably need to think about that and talk to your statisticians.
Talk to your statisticians. Sage advice. Thank you so much, Paul. Okay, I'm going to acknowledge we do have a number of questions. They keep going up every time I think we're checking them off the list, but we're not going to get through them all today. We're going to have to think about maybe a dedicated session to explore some of these questions in greater depth. But the final question I'm going to pose, I'm going to ask Flo to answer and then also ask Manuela to give your perspectives on this. Has there been any research looking into respondent burden with event-driven eDiaries? And are there design or implementation techniques that improve completion for patients? So Flo and then Manuela.
Yeah, so I think one thing that we do touch on the paper is obviously thinking about respondent burden. And I think another thing we also highlight, which comes to Paul's point previously, is that we know event-driven diaries are being used in clinical trials, and they have been, but there's not much published on them and their use and what, the success stories are and what the maybe not so great elements are or what isn't working. And so I think we need more of that published and more of that available so that we can really enhance these best practices based on that actual evidence. And I think another thing that we emphasize in the paper is making sure that the questions in the diary are driven by the endpoints in your protocol. There's always this tendency or this temptation to maybe be like, but we could capture this as well. And what about this? This could be interesting. And it absolutely could be, but you risk your actual endpoint data if you then overburden people with a longer diary, which could lead to that fatigue. So I think it should very much be driven by your protocol endpoints. And I think also people who are experiencing these types of events tend to be tracking them anyway in their life. So they are usually quite used to it. And so keeping track of it and entering it doesn't seem to be as much of a burden as we might think.
Thanks, Flo. Manuela, any additional thoughts?
There's not so much that I can add to this very thorough answer, but maybe we can finish with a practical example, because we mentioned in the paper, for example, IBS participants themselves raised concerns about accuracy reporting bowel movements over a 24-hour recall period. And this is an evidence-based moving into an event-driven approach in the first place. So I think really considering what drives burden is a mix of all the considerations that we talked about today, and that is what can define. But to Flo's point, the honest answer is that a dedicated burden research in EDAD specifically is currently limited. So there's space there to fill the gap even more.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Manuela. That will close the Q&A. As I said, I think we'll have a conversation about maybe extending some other discussion opportunity around this topic, because there is very clearly broad interest. Thank you for your attendance. We've got a little summary slide on here, which will be available on the webinar. The webinar will be available on CPATH's YouTube channel. It will be accessible to everyone, so you can pass this on. And again, keep an eye out on the channels. We might do something sort of dedicated to exploring some of the use cases here. So, but with that, thank you so much, everyone, for attending. My sincerest thanks to the excellent panel. I hope you've been informed. Have a great rest of your day, and thank you again from the Critical Path Institute.